Alright, hello and welcome back to the podcast, everybody, and to something I did intend to do for a while, but only just now got around to writing down the numbers for. So we're going to go through various countries' oil consumption numbers, and actually go through the breakdown of their consumption numbers, how much is actually being used as what products, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, etc. So to start off with, under normal conditions in present day, global oil consumption had risen up to about 102 million barrels per day, and within that the major product numbers were gasoline consumption, roughly between 24 and 25 million barrels per day globally, diesel fuel consumption, roughly 28 million barrels per day globally, jet fuel consumption, about 8 or just under 8 million barrels per day globally, marine fuel consumption or fuel oil consumption by larger vessels. The marine fuel segment does not contain or constitute the lighter boat fuels for like personal boats and yachts and things. So your redneck Cajun uncle's shrimping boat does not factor into those numbers. And global consumption of oil to make petrochemicals was about 6.8 million barrels per day. And oil used to make all the various types of plastics, which is not just polyethylene and polypropylene, but everything else that falls in there. Styrofoam is under the plastic umbrella, PVC pipe is under the plastic umbrella, polyester fiber is technically under the plastic umbrella too, polyurethane foam for pillows and mattresses, urethane insulation, rubber, and all else. So consumption of oil to make all the various things that fall under the plastic umbrella was about 13 million barrels a day. So going down each country, and be aware we're not literally going to do every single country on the face of the earth. So for the most part, basically going to be mostly everyone who's above the, probably roughly above the 250,000 barrel per day consumption level. So obviously first is still the US for now. China is very quickly coming up on it in consumption levels though. But for now, the US is usually between 20 and 22 million barrels per day. And for the US, the breakdown is major product numbers. Gasoline consumption, usually about, on average, 9.5 million barrels per day. Diesel fuel consumption for the US, usually right around 4 million barrels a day on average. Jet fuel fluctuates a bit more. And under normal circumstances, under non-2020 and non-early 2021 circumstances, it would usually be anywhere between 1.6 and 2.1 million barrels per day of jet fuel consumption. And U.S. marine fuel consumption can be a bit inconsistent, fluctuating pretty often between 200 and 400,000 barrels a day. U.S. oil for petrochemical production has dropped over the years, over the decades now, technically, as most U.S. Petrochemical businesses have, outsourced their production to other countries. So U.S. petrochemical synthesis now is down to usually around 300,000 barrels per day or so, while the U.S. plastics umbrella total is roughly, it fluctuates, but roughly 2.5-ish million barrels per day. China, obviously, the next biggest one on the list, has recently hit consumption levels as high as 17 million barrels per day. And its breakdown recently consists of gasoline consumption, roughly between 3.5 and 4 million barrels per day. Diesel fuel consumption, about the same as the US now, at just above 4, averaging 4.1. Under normal circumstances, China's jet fuel consumption was approaching 1 million barrels per day, and marine fuel, as China is a major exporter and importer, and just a global products shipper in both directions, China's marine fuel consumption levels are a bit more consistent than the US, and a bit higher, averaging 500,000 barrels per day, and China's combined petrochemical synthesis and all plastics products umbrella production is over 4 million barrels per day for both of them put together, at about 4.3, as not just the actual products themselves, like the toys, the electronics, the power cords, the everything, but China is also where a lot of the material itself gets refined and synthesized. Next down the list from China is obviously India, who before 2020 happened had made it up to 5.5 million barrels per day. And so India's breakdown as of most recently, gasoline consumption now averaging over 700,000 barrels per day. Diesel fuel consumption almost up to 2, averaging 1.8 in present day, 1.8 million barrels per day that is. Jet fuel consumption usually around 250,000, about 250,000 barrels per day. Marine fuel still only at about 120,000 barrels per day, and petrochemicals plus plastics umbrella is a bit over 1 million at about 1.3 million barrels per day. As apart from China, you probably guessed a lot of stuff is also made in India now. And next down is Japan. Japan is at about 4 million barrels per day presently, and their breakdown goes as follows. Gasoline consumption now down to roughly 850,000 barrels per day on average. Diesel fuel consumption about 770,000 on average. Jet fuel consumption about 230,000. Marine fuel consumption up there with it, about 230,000 also, as Japan is also a large seafaring and product shipping nation. And petrochemicals and plastics umbrella combination is about 970,000 barrels per day. Russia averaging pretty flat at about 3.3 million barrels per day of domestic consumption for the last 10 years or so. And their breakdown is gasoline consumption about 800,000 barrels a day, the same as their diesel fuel consumption, roughly also about 800,000 barrels a day. Jet fuel consumption about 220,000. Marine fuel consumption about 150, and petrochemicals plus plastics about the same as Japan, actually, about 960,000 barrels per day. Then we have Saudi Arabia, usually at about 3 million barrels per day, with their breakdown being gasoline consumption about 500,000, diesel fuel consumption about 500,000, jet fuel consumption about 90,000, and Saudi Arabia having about 200,000 barrels a day of marine fuel consumption, along with about 350,000 barrels a day of power plant fuel oil consumption, as Saudi Arabia still generates a lot of its electricity via oil-fired power plants. And their petrochemicals plus plastics umbrella synthesis total is about 1.3 million barrels per day. South Korea, usually now up to about 2.8 million barrels per day. Their breakdown is gasoline consumption, usually around 230,000. Diesel fuel, usually rated 500,000. Jet fuel, about 150,000 barrels per day. Marine fuel, rate at 250, 250,000 barrels a day. Similar to Japan, they also ship and receive a lot of stuff. And they're actually one of East Asia's major petrochemical makers. Their petrochemicals plus plastics synthesis total is usually about 1.1 million barrels per day. Brazil, about 2.4 million barrels per day of consumption in present day. Their breakdown is gasoline and diesel, an even split, 1 million barrels per day of gasoline consumption, 1 million barrels per day of diesel consumption, and then about 120,000 of jet fuel and about 100,000 of marine fuel. Canada, about the same, 2.4 million barrels per day. Their gasoline consumption, usually around 800,000. Diesel fuel rated about 500,000. Their jet fuel is usually at about 150,000. Marine fuel, only about 40,000. And petrochemicals plus plastics umbrella, about 600,000 actually. Germany, about 2.3 in present day. Their breakdown is gasoline consumption, about 500,000. Diesel fuel consumption, 1.1 million. Jet fuel consumption, 220,000 barrels a day. Marine fuel, about 50,000. And petrochemicals plus plastics umbrella, about 350. Mexico, 1.9 million barrels per day on average in present day. Their breakdown is gasoline consumption, usually around 800,000. Diesel fuel, about half that, at usually 400,000. Jet fuel consumption, usually around 90,000. Marine fuel oil consumption, around 140,000. and petrochemicals plus all plastics umbrella about 250,000. At about the same consumption level, Iran also 1.9 million barrels per day. And on average, their breakdown is gasoline consumption about 470, diesel fuel about 500,000, jet fuel only 30,000, marine fuel about 280,000. Most of the Persian Gulf nations have a high marine fuel oil consumption, or rather most large oil exporters do, being used by the tankers to export all that oil and gas. Or at least Iran used to have these numbers until the whole, sanctions started recently. And petrochemicals plus plastics umbrella, about 200,000. Indonesia, about 1.8 million barrels per day and heading up towards 2. Their breakdown is usually gasoline, 600,000 barrels per day, diesel, 500,000, and jet fuel and marine fuel both 100,000, evenly matched. And petrochemicals plus plastics umbrella, 160,000. And then we have the UK at 1.6 million barrels per day of consumption, 300,000 for gasoline, 650,000 barrels per day for diesel, 250,000 barrels per day of jet fuel consumption, about 30,000 barrels a day of marine fuel, and petrochemicals plus all plastics umbrella, about 200,000. The not-so-almost twins in terms of their consumption numbers, Thailand and Singapore, are both roughly just at about 1.5 million or a bit under it. Thailand coming in at 1.4. Its breakdown is 200,000 for gasoline consumption, 400,000 barrels a day of diesel, 120,000 barrels a day of jet fuel, as Thailand is a major tourist destination, about 40,000 barrels a day of marine fuel oil, and petrochemicals plus all plastics umbrella, about 440,000. And Singapore, closer up to 1.5, is about 20,000 barrels a day for gasoline demand, 80,000 for diesel, 170,000 for jet fuel, and Singapore, the global superport and major also just shipping traffic stopover area, and even on top of that, refiner and producer of marine fuel oil for several other nations. Marine fuel oil per day, 875,000 barrels per day. Now down to the actual twins, or rather the first pair of twins. Italy and Spain. Both average about 1.3 million barrels per day of consumption. However, both have different breakdowns, obviously. Spain's breakdown is gasoline, 120,000, diesel, 650, jet fuel and marine fuel, both coming in at 150,000. And petrochemicals plus plastics umbrella coming in at 190, while Italy, also at 1.3 million, breaks down as gasoline, 50% higher than Spain at 180,000 barrels per day, diesel fuel a bit lower at about 500,000, jet fuel about 200,000, marine fuel about 70,000, and petrochemicals plus plastics umbrella a bit higher at 240,000. And the other pair of twins, Taiwan and the Netherlands, both average a pretty flat 1 million barrels per day. For Taiwan, it breaks down as gasoline, 180,000, diesel, 100,000, jet fuel, 70,000, marine fuel, 50,000, and petrochemicals plus plastics umbrella, about 500,000, as they're functioning in a similar role as South Korea for a decent portion of Asia. Whereas China's huge petrochemical and plastics umbrella number is primarily for one itself, and then the rest is exported to the West. The Netherlands also averages about 1. Its breakdown is gasoline consumption about 100,000, diesel fuel about 200,000, jet fuel about 80,000, marine fuel 3 times higher than Taiwan at 150,000 barrels a day, and petrochemicals and plastics umbrella about 300,000. Over between Europe and Asia, Turkey has now made it up to 1.1 million barrels per day on average, and its breakdown is gasoline consumption only about 60,000 barrels a day, despite it having a population of between 80 and 90 million. Diesel fuel consumption up at about 500,000 barrels per day, jet fuel about 120,000, marine fuel about 30,000, and petrochemicals and plastics umbrella about 180,000. and we're almost under 1 million now. The UAE averaging about 1 million, with its numbers coming in as gasoline consumption about 200,000 barrels a day, despite only having a population of about 9 million. Diesel fuel about 60,000. Jet fuel, because of Emirates Airlines and Dubai, about 180,000 barrels a day, and about 300,000 barrels a day of marine fuel, both from the tankers going in and out, and also from cargo ships and bulk carriers and everything else. As with the UAE being a mega global super tourist hub now, they're constantly importing a lot of stuff in, and basically no power plant fuel oil consumption anymore, as the UAE, similar to Kuwait, has basically switched off all of their oil-fired power generation over to natural gas, and now has started up their Baraka nuclear power plant. Australia nowadays at about 1.1 million, averaging about 300,000 barrels a day for gasoline, 500,000 barrels a day for diesel, 160,000 barrels a day for jet fuel, about 60,000 for marine fuel, and in petrochemicals plus plastics umbrella about 130,000. Egypt averaging about 800,000 barrels a day. Their breakdown goes as gasoline about 170,000 on average, diesel fuel about 280,000, jet fuel only about 25,000, marine fuel about 150,000 because of the Suez Canal, and petrochemicals plus plastics umbrella only about 30,000. Iraq has been heading up through the 700,000s up towards 800, and their breakdown is 130,000 barrels a day for gasoline consumption, about 300,000 barrels a day for diesel, only 10,000 for jet fuel, about 130,000 of marine fuel, mostly for obviously oil tankers. Iraq generates a lot of its electricity, what bit it has, from gas, and also from just literally importing electricity over the border from both Iran and Kuwait. So Iraq doesn't have some exorbitant power generation fuel oil numbers. And Iraq's petrochemical plus plastics synthesis umbrella is about 250,000, about 250,000. Malaysia, usually up at about 700,000. Their breakdown is 300,000 barrels per day of that is gasoline consumption, about 200,000 barrels per day is diesel fuel, 70,000 jet fuel, 20,000 marine fuel oil, and about 30,000 for petrochemicals and plastics. South Africa, about 700,000 as well, but with a different breakdown. Their breakdown is gasoline consumption about 200,000, diesel fuel about 250,000, jet fuel about 50,000, marine fuel about 30,000, and petrochemicals and plastics about 100,000. Pakistan used to be up at Egypt's area, about 800,000. However, over the later 2010s, they had a sudden drop. I don't know if they went through some kind of economic turmoil or contraction or something, but they took a sudden drop and have been down at around 600,000. And their breakdown of that goes as gasoline consumption about 180, diesel fuel about 200,000, jet fuel about 20, marine fuel oil about 150, and petrochemicals and plastic synthesis only about 30,000. Vietnam, a couple years back, crossed over the 500,000 mark and is heading up towards 600,000 now, as Vietnam is rapidly rising, and their breakdown of that roughly 550 amount goes as gasoline consumption about 150,000, diesel fuel about 200,000, jet fuel about 40,000, marine fuel oil about 10, and petrochemicals and plastics about 30. And after being stuck for a while closer down to 300 until the 2010s, Nigeria has now resumed rising and has made it up to about 500,000 barrels per day of consumption, with their breakdown being gasoline consumption composing the same as the US on average, about half of their entire oil consumption, about 250,000 out of that 500,000. Diesel fuel about 140,000, jet fuel only about 20,000, marine fuel only about 20,000. Algeria is at about 430,000 on average, with their breakdown being gasoline about 100,000 barrels per day of that, diesel fuel about 200,000, and then jet fuel only about 10,000. And marine fuel oil, surprisingly negligible, but on one hand, their export ratio is pretty small, and most of what they're exporting anyways kind of just goes through pipelines across the water gap to Europe. And petrochemical and plastics, only about 20,000. Argentina, on average, about 600,000 barrels per day. The breakdown is gasoline consumption, about 160, diesel fuel, about 250,000, jet fuel, only about 30,000, marine fuel, only about 50,000, and petrochemicals and plastics, about 200,000. Belgium is usually around 650,000, with their breakdown being gasoline, 50,000, diesel fuel, 230,000, jet fuel about 30,000, marine fuel about 140,000, and petrochemicals and plastics about 130. Kuwait, back over in the Persian Gulf again, about 450,000 in present day. Gasoline consumption, 75,000. Diesel fuel, about 60,000. Jet fuel, about 110,000 barrels a day of marine fuel. And petrochemicals and plastics, about 140,000. Colombia, over in South America, is at about 450 as well. Their breakdown is gasoline, 120. Diesel, 130. Jet fuel, only about 30. Marine fuel, about 20, and petrochemicals and plastics, only about 20 as well. The Philippines are almost up to 500,000, trying to catch up to Vietnam, and their breakdown goes as gasoline consumption, 100,000 barrels per day, diesel fuel, 200,000, jet fuel, 50,000, marine fuel, 30,000, and petrochemicals and plastics, about 40. Chile, over in South America, the Saudi Arabia of copper, they are usually at about 400,000 in present day, the biggest chunk of which is diesel fuel, a huge chunk of which is being used by all the mining vehicles and heavy mining equipment, mining all of that copper. Their breakdown is gasoline consumption, about 80,000, diesel fuel, about 170, jet fuel, only about 25,000, marine fuel, about 20,000, and most of that being the bulk carriers taking the copper ore away, and petrochemicals and plastics, only about 20,000. Over in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, growing and up to about 350,000 barrels per day of consumption now. Their numbers break down as gasoline and diesel consumption are both about even at each 100,000 barrels per day, jet fuel only about 20,000, and petrochemicals and plastics about 60,000, is now averaging between 700 and 750,000 barrels per day. Their breakdown is gasoline about 110,000 barrels a day, diesel about 370,000, jet fuel only about 20,000, marine fuel only about 15, and petrochemicals and plastics about 90,000. Sweden, and their consumption levels are about 300,000 barrels per day, breaking down as gasoline about 60,000, diesel about 110, jet fuel about 20, marine fuel about 30, and petrochemicals and plastics about 40. The Ukraine has our bottom level, our 250,000, and their breakdown of that is gasoline 50,000, diesel fuel 110,000, jet fuel only about 10,000, as eager visitors and tourists are not all that many because of, dark recent events back in 2014 and the impending threat of more dark events. Peru also has our basement level for this video, about 250,000 barrels a day of consumption, breaking down as 40,000 for gasoline, 110,000 for diesel, a decent chunk of which is also mining vehicles, jet fuel about 20,000, marine fuel about 10,000, and petrochemicals and plastics about 10,000. And only a few others left, making it above the bottom line at least. Israel, about 250,000, and their breakdown is 70,000 for gasoline, diesel fuel about 60,000, jet fuel about 25,000, marine fuel about 10,000, and petrochemicals and plastics about 50,000. And Greece, on average, is usually sticking around 300,000, and their breakdown is gasoline 50,000, diesel fuel 100,000, jet fuel about 30,000, marine fuel about 70,000, and petrochemicals and plastics about 40,000. Austria, back in Europe, usually just at about 250,000. Their breakdown is gasoline, only 40,000, diesel fuel, 160,000, jet fuel, about 20,000, marine fuel, nowhere to be seen, obviously, and petrochemicals and plastics, about 40,000. Portugal, also averaging about 250,000. Their breakdown is gasoline, only 25,000, diesel fuel, about 110,000, jet fuel, about 30,000, marine fuel, about 20,000, and petrochemicals and plastics, about 30,000. Ecuador, they now consume over half of their own oil production domestically. Their oil production has declined now to most recently around 510. Their consumption levels domestically have gotten as high as 280 or 290 recently. And their breakdown of that is gasoline, about 80,000, diesel fuel, about 90, jet fuel, only about 10,000, marine fuel, about 30,000, and petrochemicals and plastics, negligible. Okay, now that's it. So, thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. If you would like to support me, and only if you actually can do so, mind you, PayPal and Patreon links are both down in the description below. But no matter what, may God bless, protect, and save all of you, and I will see you all around next time.